Well, for those of you who, like me, are a visitor here today, this congregation is in the midst of a sermon series where they take a Christian person and talk about his or her life as a means to proclaim the gospel. Well, my person for today is Clive Staples Lewis, or as he's better known, C.S. Lewis. And when I think about my challenge of using the life and work of C.S. Lewis to proclaim the gospel, it's not so much what to share, but what not to share, because there is simply so much that I could talk about. The impact and popularity of Lewis is nearly impossible to overstate. He died November 22nd, 1963, the very day on which John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And he left behind 38 books, all of which have never gone out of print. Millions and millions of readers from all walks of life, all parts of the world, both Christians and non-Christians, are not just readers, but avid readers of his work. Multiple motion pictures, documentaries, stage productions have been made. At present, there are well over 200 individual fan clubs, readers groups, C.S. Lewis societies all around the world, and all implications are that his popularity is only continuing to grow. Well, why is that? Well, many brilliant scholars of whose sandals I am certainly unworthy to untie have attempted to answer this very question. But nevertheless, today I dare to offer up to you a thought, a reason as to why C.S. Lewis is still so incredibly popular. And you may find that, like me, this answer might surprise you, it may humble you, and very possibly inspire you. Well, C.S. Lewis was born in Belfast, Ireland in 1898, and he was raised by Christian parents, but his idyllic childhood was shattered when at the age of 10 years old, his mother died of cancer. The death of his mother caused a crack in the foundation of his Christian faith. His father never recovered from the loss, and his relationship with his son was strained for the rest of his life. And shortly after his mother's death, Lewis was sent to join his older brother Warnie at a boarding school in England. And it was there, under the influence of rationalist and humanist teachers, that Lewis used his immensely powerful intellect and rational mind to rationalize God out of his life. And he became an atheist. In school, Lewis also became a great scholar. His intellect and equally powerful imagination quite naturally led to a great love he developed for literature, great literature, especially medieval and Renaissance literature, of which he became a professor. In fact, it was this, his love of literature, that eventually led him into two traps from which his atheism would not survive. The first was that much of the great literature he read and studied and taught was written by Christians. In fact, he wrote this: "In reading Chesterton and MacDonald," Lewis said, "I did not know what I was getting myself in for. A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful in his reading. There are traps everywhere, Bibles laid open, millions of surprises, fine nets and stratagems. God is, if I may say it, very unscrupulous." The second trap was Lewis's love of good friends and good conversation. He belonged to a literary club known as the Inklings, and this small group of friends and literary enthusiasts met weekly, often in a pub, to discuss literature and to critique each other's writings. Here, Lewis was profoundly influenced by the Christian scholar J.R.R. Tolkien, author, of course, of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Lewis, an expert in medieval literature, had always loved myth and stories. But myth was not fact. Myth was something false. That was the category in which he put Christianity, as one of his fellow Inklings would later write. Lewis was longing for reality in the depths of his soul. But his mind wouldn't let him make such leaps because he knew too many things. One of the things that kept Lewis from being a Christian was that he found in ancient mythology examples of God's coming to earth and dying. And so he said, the Christian story is also a myth. There are other ones similar to it, and they're much older, so why should I believe this? Well, it was on this very point that his good friend Tolkien pushed him. Don't you see, Tolkien would argue, all the myths of history reflect the deepest longings of humanity, the longings for the myth, the true myth, the myth that becomes real. In Jesus Christ, the Word becomes flesh. Well, Lewis thought hard about Tolkien's arguments and began to pursue this thinking with his fierce intellect and sense of logic. And the more he pursued it, the more reasonable Christianity became. And yet the final step in his conversion demonstrates that in the case of faith, reason alone, it's never enough. A close friend of Lewis would write this, and then the oddest thing happened. It's as though God decided to pull the rug out from under him. Lewis and his brother Warnie went to the zoo that day where they were meeting other friends. And there was Lewis riding in the sidecar of Warnie's motorcycle. When they started for the zoo, he didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. And yet somehow, by the time they arrived at the zoo, he did. It's one of the instances where you can think, and you can write all sorts of theological works, but sometimes God just short-circuits the whole thing. He gets right in there and says, I am who I am. And this is what happened to Lewis. He didn't make up his mind about who Christ was. He was just on his way to the zoo. And when he got there, he believed. He said, it's rather like a man coming awake. You don't quite know when you wake up. You just suddenly find, hey, I'm in bed lying awake. Well, Lewis, he woke up. Indeed, he did. I believe in Christianity, he later said, as I believe in the sun, S-U-N, has risen. Not only because I see it, but because by it, I see everything else. Lewis suddenly saw everything differently, or as he would say, he began to see everything clearly for the first time. He saw with greater clarity the true intellectual strength of Christian thought and understanding. He became president of his college's Socratic Club. Here is where Christians and non-Christians would fiercely debate ideas. He believed that if Christianity were true, then over the long haul, it would prove itself to have the intellectual fiber and muscle to persevere, wrote a friend. He worked hard to demonstrate that Christianity wasn't this feeble, weak-minded understanding of reality. One of Lewis's most famous books, Mere Christianity, is a powerful, apologetic work in defense of the Christian faith. Here many readers will find, perhaps for the first time, wrote a critic, someone writing about Christian doctrine that is truly clear, often amusing, and ultimately very convincing. Or as another critic wrote, he's serious and at the same time he's lighthearted because he has such great joy in everything that he has to say about the Christian faith. Joy. Joy is in fact the central, and at the central point to practically everything that Lewis would write and talk about as a Christian. And for him, joy was this deep, rich, dominant idea. In fact, he would argue that joy is the deepest, and it is the healthiest longing within inside every human being, which if we suppress, we do so to our own serious detriment. He writes this: there lurks in modern minds that notion that to desire our own good or to earnestly hope for enjoyment is a bad thing. But if we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures fooling around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to remain making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine is what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased, writes Lewis. One of the many things that can be said of C.S. Lewis's most famous writings, the Chronicles of Narnia, is that they waken joy in the readers. The central character of these stories is, of course, the great lion, Aslan. When the children of our world who have been transported into Narnia first hear the name Aslan, each one feels something jump inside of them. Edmund felt a strange sensation, a mysterious horror. Peter suddenly felt brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or delightful strain of music had just floated by her. And Lucy got that feeling you have when you wake up in the morning and realize that it's the beginning of a holiday or the beginning of summer vacation. When the children learn that they are in fact to meet the great lion Aslan, well, they ask a very natural question. Is he quite safe? Safe, answers Mr. Beaver. Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. For just a little while, when you're reading the Narnia stories, wrote a friend of Lewis, you get your mind off all the stained glass Sunday school associations and various prejudices about Christianity and faith, and you actually attend someone who's a lot like Jesus. And your heart is wrung by the goodness of this lion and what happens and what he says to the children of this book. Then you come back to the real world and you see how perhaps you have indeed misrepresented or misunderstood Jesus before. It is so nice to meet Aslan, Jesus as lion. As Aslan himself says in one of the stories, he says to Lucy, I am in your world, but there I have another name, and you must learn to know me by that name. This is the very reason you were brought to Narnia, that by knowing me here a little, you may know me there better. The great desire of C.S. Lewis is not that we would know his name, or that we would even know of his many books and articles and stories, but that we would know Jesus, the real Jesus, the myth that became reality, the Word that became real flesh. A very dear friend of Lewis's, Walter Hooper, said this about C.S. Lewis. He prayed a great deal. I don't think I've ever come across a person who prayed so much in a train, on a bus, on a walk, or just standing for hours outside. The thing that struck me about him more than anything else was that this man really loved God. Why is Lewis so popular? This is it. He really loved God. It is this real love of God served by his incredible intellect and profound imagination, which results in all the wonderful stories and books and articles that speak to not only our heart and our mind, but to the very deepest longing that is at the core of every one of us here. C.S. Lewis would love nothing more than if God used his writings, his stories, the movies about them to help us love God more and to know more deeply how truly loved we are by God.